Welcome back after that word from our sponsors. The show continues with the long march. uh, and it was a long march, and indeed, 6,000 miles I would consider a pretty long march. Now, we left off here. I think we covered that already. And we need to go here. Imperial Japan and Imperialist Japan, which is to say that Japan becomes an imperialist country, much like the European powers. I believe I mentioned this once before in class, but Japan, as we know, took a crash course in industrialization and became one of the most powerful, wealthiest countries in the world in a short amount of time after the Meiji Restoration. And from there, they had sort of everything that a great power in the world had at the time, except for control of foreign colonies. And so there was a certain amount of prestige, believe it or not, for European countries as well as Japan to acquire colonies. So Japan, for that prestige and other reasons to advance their power and economic prowess, they moved into sort of a course of aggressive foreign policy. As Bentley says, after the Great War, Japan achieved great power status and appeared to accept the international status quo, which means kind of everything the same. Everything stays the same, balanced. The status quo that the major powers fashioned in the aftermath of war, meaning the Great War. After joining the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, which we have today, a international body designed to get the world or large parts of it together with representatives from all the nations to hammer out agreements on over wars or any kind of international crisis. So after joining the League as one of the Big Five powers, Japan had moved into the Big Five status. The Japanese government entered into a series of international agreements that sought to improve relations among countries with conflicting interests in Asia and the Pacific. So not only was there a League of Nations, there were other smaller multilateral agreements taking place. As a signatory to a number of Washington Conference treaties, I should say several, in 1922, Japan agreed to limit naval development and guaranteed China's territorial integrity. The Washington treaties, among other things, were designed to limit the navies of all of the major naval powers in the world, including the United States, Japan, and Great Britain. And they all were trying to avoid having to spend, an enormous amount of money, ever growing amount of money, competing with each other and building up larger and larger navies. So this is one of the, again, multilateral deals or agreements that kind of went along with the League of Nations, which was, not every country participated in it. In fact, the United States did not, but most countries of the world did. So there's a general international body, and there are a number of multilateral agreements. Japan was involved in both until about 1931. Bentley goes on to say, politicians who supported Japan's role in the international industrial capitalist system faced increasing opposition from those who were inclined toward a militarist vision of a self-sufficient Japan that would dominate East Asia. That is to say, Japanese officials, leaders were kind of divided into two camps. Those who believed that the better course of action would be to use their newfound, great power status to become one of the leaders in the industrial capitalist world and system, which really what pretty much was led by the United States and Great Britain by this time, but Japan was a major player in it. But there was, particularly in the military, a different vision that wasn't so interested in capitalism and economic growth as it was in territorial growth and military glory. And in the end, the latter actually won out, and this is where you get the Empire of Japan, right? Empire of Japan and Imperialist Japan. So this was the beginning of Japanese imperial territorial expansion and brutal conquest. And the emphasis has to be on brutal. This is Japan's first sort of aggressive, bloody entry into China, and it would only go further throughout the 1930s and end up in not only Japan conquering one after another major Chinese cities, though they never conquered the entire country. No one could do that, but a great deal of atrocities were committed. A great number of atrocities that only, I think, don't get very much attention today because, right, this is just before World War II, the 1930s is, and the Holocaust and Hitler's crimes were so much bigger in scale than what the Japanese military forces, with government responsibility as well, did. That kind of gets the Japanese atrocities get lost in the shuffle. But in terms of what they did to human beings, it's on par, sadly. This may come up a little bit later as well. The Mukden incident that you see at the top of the slide there was Japan's sort of fixing a situation, creating a situation whereby they could go to war and invade Manchuria and sort of claim, hey, we're just protecting ourselves. We were, fired upon first. They blew up the Japanese military, or that part of the Japanese military that was in on this plan, blew up a railway in Manchuria and blamed it on China, as it says, as the pretext for the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Incredibly, the Japanese government back in Tokyo tried to stop its own military, and it hadn't even been involved. So this was really a military operation without government support, which isn't supposed to happen in governments or to governments or in countries. And the government failed to stop the invasion and eventually just said, okay, well, we can't really stop them from doing it. Let's just sign on to it and kind of own it now. And then at that point, the Japanese government, along with the military, in conjunction with, established the puppet government of Manchukuo. A puppet government means they installed a Chinese government with Chinese officials and leaders, but who were basically taking orders from Tokyo, taking orders from the Japanese military, in country. The League of Nations called for Japan to withdraw from Manchuria, partly at the behest of the Chinese, but Japan refused and withdrew from the League of Nations. So much for the League of Nations being able to achieve peaceful redress of grievances. So Japan only kept its control of Manchukuo government in Manchuria, and then used that as a launch pad to go further into China and later in the decade into Southeast Asia, all by force, military force, bloody military force. We'll have cause to come back to Japan in a later unit near the end of our class. Next, the scramble for Africa under colonial domination. And the map on the right is quite simple, but you see that almost all of Africa between about 1870 and the outbreak of the Great War, World War I, 1914, was carved up by these several European powers here, and so Africa was colonized big time. It had been already a little bit before this period, but the scramble for Africa, as they call it, from 1870 on, saw like a foot race, a competition between European powers to see who could control more of Africa. And of course, it wasn't a pretty sight. Because this was also done with a great deal of bloodshed and brutal force. Thomas Pakenham, who wrote a book about the scramble for Africa, says, in a half generation, the scramble gave Europe virtually the whole continent of Africa, including 30 new colonies and protectorates. Protectorate is sort of like a colony, a partial colony. 10 million square miles of new territory, and 100 million dazed new subjects, acquired by one, often brutal, method after another. Africa was sliced up like a cake, the pieces swallowed by 5 rival nations. There are more than 5, but the 5 main, actually 6 main ones here: Germany, Italy, Portugal, France, and Britain. But at the center, exploiting the rivalry, stood one enigmatic individual and self-styled philanthropist controlling the heart of the continent, Leopold II, King of the Belgians. Enigmatic is the right term, which means sort of mysterious, hard to understand. But Belgium controlled or carved out a colony right in the center of Africa. There, the kind of the pink or orangish region, right in the middle, the Congo. But why does it say one enigmatic individual? Because for a time, the Belgian king, the aforementioned Leopold II, actually kind of carved out that colony himself. The Belgian government wasn't wild about establishing a colonial presence in Africa or anywhere else for that matter, but Leopold II was, and so he basically just financed it himself and did it on his own. He's a king. Although by that time, Belgium was far down the road to being not an absolute monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy, where the king had to share power with an elected legislature. It was the legislature that wasn't really interested, but Leopold said, I'm doing it anyway without you. Later on, Belgium, the government, basically stepped in and decided to be involved in the colony themselves. But at first, Leopold II could kind of say, unlike anyone else in the world or in Europe, that I have my own colony, mine, not my country's, but mine. And we'll see he was a very frightening individual in many ways. So the balance sheet of empire, costs and benefits, it's very hard these days, and hardly anyone does, to make a case in favor of any benefits at all to empire. But since the debate is still sort of out there, we can draw up the balance sheet. Sort of on the defending side, the defending empire, a great historian, though I don't agree with him here on this, Neil Ferguson, says that prima facie there seems to be a plausible case that empire, in other words, was a good thing. So he points to, in the book quoted there, rule of law, liberty, basic freedoms, representative or democratic governments, capitalism, as things that were all sort of brought. You could also throw in the fact that the Europeans brought or built all kinds of schools and colleges, K through 12 or the equivalent thereof, in universities, that all kinds of medical facilities were built, etc. However, the case on the other side appears to us today to be kind of a slam dunk, and I agree more with Frantz Fanon. Fanon is no longer around, but he was a radical anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist from a French colony, and his writings are now famous, but he opposed, flagrantly opposed, and through staunch political activism throughout his career, not just French but European imperialism. And he says in one of his books, imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove, not only from our land, but from our minds as well. So Fanon says in no uncertain terms, more or less, there are no benefits to empire. In fact, it's basically like a disease that we have to deal with even after the colonialists, the French or the British or whoever, are gone. He thought then all of the consequences were negative for the people colonized by the Europeans, and also believed that the consequences were negative for the colonizers themselves, at least the people, the public of European countries. Though that's something for dispute even now. Though I think Fanon was right, Ferguson is wrong. there is this common view that I think is a misnomer, that the European countries got rich because of imperialism, and it's an explanation for how and why some of the countries and places they colonized have been poor ever since. Well, certainly the process of European colonialism and imperialism was so brutal in many ways that it may be part of the reason that such countries, some of them, struggle even today. But it's not the case that Europe got rich sort of off of the backs of the rest of the world. And the reason for that is Europe didn't get rich from its colonies. Certain individuals and certain corporations from Britain, Germany, France, the U.S. got rich. But as far as the sort of result or percentage of GDP, gross domestic product, it was always negligible compared to sort of the trade, manufacturing and trade and commerce that European countries did with each other, and the U.S. and Japan and the rich countries. The amount of economic, relevance of the colonies to the European, the European economies was always small. Cecil Rhodes and the Cape to Cairo idea, emblematic of European imperial ambitions. Cecil Rhodes, who's being caricatured on the right, and he's got his astride all of Africa from north to south, rather dramatically and confidently, even arrogantly, spreading his arms out. Rhodes became super wealthy, one of the wealthiest individuals in the world, mainly by exploiting Africans on African soil in South Africa, mining. Of course, he didn't do the mining himself. Africans did. That's one of the ugly faces of imperialism. But Rhodes owned the diamonds, owned the land, and had them sent back to Europe to be processed and sold for millions and millions of dollars. Rhodes is, in a sense, still with us. The Rhodes Scholarship is named after him because he bequeathed money to that scholarship program. There was a country called Rhodesia in Africa, which has changed names since then, named after him. And the largest, really, monopoly diamond company in the world, De Beers, was his creation. But I'm really using him here to show how the Europeans, and more specifically the British, since he was British, thought of sort of their role in the world. A book on Britain around this time period, 19th century and beyond, says no person managed more successfully than Rhodes to combine the down-to-earth practicality and the starry-eyed idealism that constituted the late 19th century imperialistic spirit. I have a hard time saying imperialistic spirit. He once wrote that it was his life's work for the furtherance of the British Empire, for the bringing of the whole civilized world under British rule, for the making of the Anglo-Saxon race into an empire. Certainly there's racism in this. The word Anglo-Saxon is a sort of a touchy one for good reason today. And there's arrogance, Eurocentrism as well in all this. So it shows, I think, something about the thought process behind European expansion, and colonialism, and at the very least arrogant, and I think not a stretch to say that this is racism. This is the idea, and that's what he's saying, that the British do everything better than everyone else, so the whole civilized world should kind of want to be under our control. They'll be better off for it. He was fairly young when he wrote that. It has sort of some of the hallmarks of sort of youthful confidence and sort of boasting, but nonetheless, he said it, and he has to wear it. There he is, Leopold II, and the Belgian Congo. Leopold was a striking figure, almost in all negative ways. And I apologize for the other picture to the right. If you don't want to look at this and a couple other photos that follow, I understand. You can kind of skip through it. But I do believe that to understand history properly, we have to see it in all of its reality, brutal reality, racist cruelty, as it says here, to really get an understanding of what we're talking about when we're dealing with European imperialism. Leopold had his own personal colony, for at least for a time, as I already said. He was a greedy king. He was already rich because he was a king. He inherited the throne from his father, got to live lavishly in palaces in Brussels and Belgium, but he wanted to make more money. He majored in economics in college when he was still a prince, not the king yet, and decided that he wanted a colony. And his attitude was sort of like, well, I'm too important to be the king of little old Belgium. Why wasn't I sort of born into the British royal family? Why didn't I become the king of England or the emperor of Germany? Why did I get little old Belgium? I'm too important for that. So he wanted to sort of enlarge his presence on the European and world stage by becoming sort of a colonizer, and he did carve out, as we saw in the Congo, a huge colony. So he got what he wanted. His methods of doing so were beyond cruel, and there was massive suffering, loss of life, and injury to Africans in the Congo. That is his responsibility, is on his shoulders, not his alone. But he made millions of dollars by forcing African peoples in this region to go and tap rubber vines. Rubber was becoming an increasingly lucrative resource on world markets in the industrial capitalist economies of the world. And so he made millions and millions by forcing Africans to tap the rubber vines under threat of punishment. And you can see from the brutal photo, which I don't even like to look at, one of the punishments for not complying with the orders. That's not exactly the way it happened, but in fact, the way it happened is actually more cruel than that. But for reasons of time, it was cruel to the point of, those are children there mostly, who are missing limbs because of Leopold's and the Belgians' policy with regard to Africans working to bring in resources, mostly rubber, that they got no benefit from, got no payment for. This was mostly really slave labor that was going on here, as it says at the bottom. Leopold never even went to the Congo, not once. It made him fabulously wealthy. He was responsible, again, probably for the deaths of tens of thousands, maybe more. He had a railroad built from the coast to the inland. The Congo is sort of in the center of Africa, and thousands died. Africans died just building the railroad. So this person, stands out in history, and not in a good way. But it is sort of the ugly face, or one of the ugly faces of European imperialism. Another one is this guy, less well known, Lothar von Trotha, a German name, and he was responsible for an attempt at what appears to have been genocide in a colony that the Germans controlled, German Southwest Africa, in 1904. Richard Evans, in a book on this period in Europe, says some 14,000 troops were dispatched from Berlin under General Trotha. I know, he said, that African tribes yield only to violence. To exercise this violence with crass terrorism and even gruesomeness was and is my policy. The group of Africans that were sort of on the other side of this, unfortunately, was the Herero tribe. Herero men were shot, women and children were driven into the desert and left to starve. deliberately by Trotha and his troops. This is sometimes looked at as sort of an episode, a precursor to the rise of the Nazis to power. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I wouldn't be surprised if it is. I mean, that you could make a connection, but I'm not sure of that because there are plenty. We just saw Leopold II, who wasn't a German, and we could pick other examples. Or I could easily have used other examples of non-German Europeans doing things equally cruel. But it's also true to say that just so we have some understanding here, the governor of German Southwest Africa, the German political governor, was against this and resigned when the government didn't listen to him. Instead, they listened to the general here, von Trotha, who was supposed to be under the governor's command. But apparently the German government, and it wasn't the Nazi government yet, Hitler wasn't around yet, so it wasn't a fascist dictatorship. Germany was a parliamentary country, not as democratic as Britain, France, the US, but certainly not a tyranny or despotism at that point. That would come in due time with the rise to power of the Nazis. Nonetheless, von Trotha did get the support of his government at home to carry out this, this craven act of brutality and just of ghastly proportions. But the governor, I forget his name, was tried to stop it and was against it. And that's not to. I'm not saying that to try to excuse what any of this from the German side. All I am saying is that it is complicated. There are people in every country that sign on to these kind of things, and some that are horrified by them. So really, what I'm making, the argument I'm making here is that European imperialism was particularly cruel, not that German imperialism was particularly cruel. It was all immensely damaging, destructive, and horrific for those at the other end. Again, another picture on the right that is not pleasant to look at, but it does give you a sense of the human suffering in history. Unfortunately, to understand what we're up against in the world in terms of good and bad, in this case bad, it's sometimes important to look, I think, square in the face of the most difficult things to deal with, things that aren't pleasant. So I apologize, but it's we need to, I think, know these things happened so we can hopefully prevent them from happening ever again in the future. Challenges to European authority coming from Africa and starting kind of everywhere. After the Great War, World War I, we've already mentioned that Europe was staggered by that war. The Europeans fought each other, slaughtered each other, and weakened each other badly. So it's not surprising that's really after World War I that you start to see challenges to European authority from their colonies. Not all of it came just after the war. Some of it had already started, but there was certainly a noticeable uptick after the war. And Professor Bentley, good old reliable Professor Bentley, says, while the world's attention was focused on the slaughter taking place in European lands between 1914 and 1918, Africans mounted bold challenges to European colonial authority. The cause of widespread revolts varied. In some cases, as in Libya, revolts simply represented continued resistance to European rule. So they had already been sort of resisting the Europeans by force. In other cases, the departure of European personnel during the war, which seemed to signal a weakening of power, encouraged those who had previously only contemplated revolt. Remember, the Great War required so much, so many personnel, so much human capital, to the slaughter for the most part, as well as materials, resources, etc., that the European countries all leaned on their empires, their colonial subjects, to provide them with those things. And so but they also had to draw down their own employees there. So in British India, for instance, where we have already learned that there were tens of thousands of British bureaucrats and administrators who were, basically the government of India, the British needed a lot of those people in the military or otherwise back home, so they decreased the number of civil servants and even soldiers that were stationed in India and other places. And this is true throughout the British Empire and throughout the European empires. So when people in Kenya or Libya or wherever else it was saw, hey, the Europeans, we know they're at war with each other and they're drawing out all kinds of people, so their population is lower. Not only did they appear weaker because it's a smaller number we'd have to overthrow now if we rise up in violent rebellion, but it must show that they're weak, weaker, if they can no longer keep as many people here, to keep us, subjugated. So the Mumbo cult in Kenya also targeted Europeans and their Christian religion, declaring, quote, that all Europeans are our enemies, but the time is coming when they will disappear from our country, which was an ominous sign because it wasn't too many years or a few decades off before that actually happened. The major inspiration for most revolts stemmed from the resentment and hatred engendered by the compulsory conscription of soldiers and carriers. No matter the cause, colonial authorities responded ruthlessly and succeeded in putting down all revolts. So some of the revolts came as a response to being forced to participate in the war or give up, taxes or resources in a way that was a setback to the colonial people on the ground, as they're having to give up resources and their own lives if they're sent to the Western Front in Europe to fight. So you can see why people would rise up against that when they're being forced to do all of these things against their will, and many of them losing their lives as part of it. But the Europeans ruthlessly crushed all of the rebellions. So the time had not come yet where these revolts and uprisings were successful, but they were kind of a sign of things to come, or at least we can see that now with the advantage of hindsight. As far as the colonial economy is concerned, Professor Bentley will lead us off here. Colonial powers pursued two key objectives in Africa. They wanted to make sure the colonized paid for the institutions, bureaucracies, judiciary, police, and military forces that kept them in subjugation. And they developed export-oriented economies characterized by the exchange of unprocessed raw materials or minimally processed cash crops for manufactured goods from abroad. In pursuit of these goals, colonial authorities imposed economic structures that altered, subordinated, or destroyed previously self-sufficient African economies. So that's a rather harsh statement. It applies, but wow. So he goes on to talk about European use or forced use of African labor. A white settler in Kenya, he says, candidly expressed the view held by many colonial administrators, quote, "We have stolen his land," meaning the African's land. "Now we must steal his limbs." Right? Compulsory labor is the corollary to our occupation of the country. So forced labor, which one could say was akin to slavery, which was also incredibly brutal and inhumane. But the first part of this is based on sort of a common belief among economists and historians studying these kind of events, that, and this would be true even today if the theory holds, that the countries that manufacture goods, like high-tech, manufacturing, high-tech countries that trade with countries that either what they have to sort of trade is either agricultural output or natural resources like oil or silver or copper or whatever, or coal, whatever it may be. That in those situations, the countries that are the manufacturers, and they're trading their manufactured goods, again, high-tech manufacturing for basically foods and minerals, things like that. That the manufacturing-based country, the one that's gone through an industrial revolution most of the time, always has the advantage. And that certainly sounds true, and it very well may be. Although I have read some criticisms of the overall theory, and there has been some scholarly work that's poked some fairly successful, somewhat successful holes in the theory. But at any rate, Bentley certainly, the way he wrote this, it's clear that he believes that the theory is correct, and I think most historians do. And again, I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm just throwing out there, show you how much contested ground we have in history. Interpretations sort of vary, everywhere we look, as we've already seen in the class. But there's no doubt that the colonial economies of all the European countries relied heavily on basically forcing African peoples to work against their will and to sort of dominate their economies and use African economies for European gain. If they helped Africans, as a byproduct, then so be it. But the goal was to benefit the European home country and not the Africans themselves. There was a rise of nationalist leaders in Africa in the late 19th into the 20th century. Our textbook at least lists a number of them. I've picked one who became famous, Jomo Kenyatta here. And Bentley says about this, ideas concerning self-determination articulated by President Woodrow Wilson during the war, meaning the Great War, and the notion of accountability of colonial powers that had been sown during the Great War gained adherence among a group of African nationalists. Wilson had talked a great deal in criticism of colonialism and imperialism, although when push came to shove, he wasn't always sort of, he talked more than he acted on it, that's for sure. Nonetheless, African leaders like Kenyatta picked up on what Wilson said and called the Americans and the European powers on their criticisms of their own imperialist colonialist practices. These nationalist ideas influenced the growth of African nationalism and the development of incipient nationalist movements. So a nationalist movement means you get a mass of people together, kind of a protest movement. So nationalist leaders with nationalist ideology. All right, nationalism, one of our isms, going back to the French Revolution. So it's spreading around the world. We saw already earlier in this lecture that nationalism had spread to India, and now it's having a similar effect here in Africa, or right around the same time, having this kind of effect on the African continent. An emerging class of native urban intellectuals, frequently educated in Europe, Kenyatta was one of them, like Gandhi, became especially involved in the formation of ideologies that promised freedom from colonialism and promoted new national identities. Kenya, Ghana, other countries were formed eventually after World War II, but they're moving in that direction because, in part, of these leaders forming movements, getting more and more people involved in protests in one form or another against European power, colonial power. Neo-colonialism and American economic imperialism in Latin America. So we now move across the world, across the Atlantic to Latin America, which goes from Mexico to Chile, at the tip of South America, Central America, in between. So much of America's involvement in Latin America during this same period, late 19th, early 20th centuries, is so much based on economic promotion of sort of economic power by the United States that the phrase economic imperialism does, I think, apply. And we'll see the U.S. military, U.S. government were involved in protecting American corporate assets time and time and time again, because American leaders saw this as not just about capitalist profits, but about sort of a connection between capitalist profits and American economic, political, and military power in a more general sense. Bentley, Latin American states were no strangers to foreign economic domination in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Their export-oriented economies had long been tied to global finance and had long been subject to controls imposed by foreign investors. The major evolution in economic neo-colonialism during this period concerned the growing predominance of the United States in the economic affairs of the Latin American nations. So to simplify that, before the United States, Latin America, we know, had been dominated by Spain, Portugal, and other European countries that had colonial, interests there. But the United States started to impose its will more and more from the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which goes back kind of before where we are right now. But sort of gradually from there, the United States elbowed the other major powers out of the way, Great Britain, Spain, France, and said, no, we're going to dominate Latin America. We're going to sort of lock it up under our control. And the U.S. pretty much did. And to this day, there's a lot of understandable animosity and bad blood towards America in this part of the world. I don't mean everyone, but because of heavy-handed policy on the part of our government. And among those things that were done heavy-handedly was the famous building of the Panama Canal, completed in 1913, started many years before that. It was an engineering marvel. It's not as strategically important now as it once was. Keep in mind, in 1913, there wasn't, air travel, and so most things that everything that had to go, from one country to another, if they weren't connected by land, had to go by sea and by ship. So the Panama Canal was of enormous strategic interest and importance to the U.S., both economically and militarily, because without that canal, to go by ship, say from the east coast of the U.S. to the west, or vice versa, you have to go all the way around the tip of South America. Sometimes what happened is people would go to the Central American countries here and sort of essentially pull their ships across, or boats across, and have other ships waiting for them and carry their supplies, and then transport them from one ship on one coast to another ship on the other coast. So it could be done that way, but that's pretty cumbersome as well. So the Panama Canal was of incredible importance. However, the U.S. Did lean on Central America to get this done, in the person of President Theodore Roosevelt, who you can see there in a little picture, kind of in the center right. The canal was 51 miles long, built between the 1880s and 1913. The French were involved, then the U.S., and Theodore Roosevelt, or TR, basically forced the hand of this canal being built. Panama was part of Colombia at the time, but there already was an independence movement building in Panama, and a lot of people supported the idea of an independent Panama breaking away from the mother country of Colombia. And Roosevelt basically said, and I'm simplifying here a lot, but he said, if you will let us build a canal through the country, Panama, and let us control it, then we'll support your revolution and help it succeed. And that's one of the reasons that this happened at all. TR's most notable achievement, I forget the author's name, and I didn't include it. It's in a later slide as well. TR's most notable achievement, in some ways, was to push through the Panama Canal. That meant softening up with cash the corrupt and venal government of Colombia, which owned the Panama Isthmus. Roosevelt connived a local conspiracy to set up a separate state of Panama, recognized by his own government in 1903. A new treaty was put through immediately with the Panamanian government, giving the U.S. control of the canal zone in return for U.S. support of the new country. This is from a book about American imperialism with that title by a professor called Hopkins. I forget his first name. We'll get there. Dollar diplomacy. Again, you should be able to see here that the United States, by the late 19th, early 20th century, was putting sort of a large emphasis on its economic penetration of and control of the Latin American countries. As Professor Hopkins says here, again, the U.S. had greater influence in smaller states that were closer to home, particularly those in Central America. He's saying that after talking about the U.S. role in other parts of the world. They were attractive, such small countries closer to home, precisely because, being independent, they did not arouse the degree of opposition that curtailed expatriate enterprise in the formal empire. Meaning, since these countries were usually formally independent, and they had their own governments. It wasn't like British India, where there were British civil servants running and governing the country. These countries were at least nominally independent. But that actually made it easier to get corporate and business interests in there without raising too much suspicion, because you don't have troops and, again, an American white governor of the place. So U.S. companies, however, once they invested, invariably committed Washington to intervening when business plans went awry. The U.S. took control of the Dominican Republic's finances after New York, just as an example, after a New York firm, the San Domingo Improvement Company, had, quote, improved the country enough to the point where it faced bankruptcy. The U.S. decision to occupy Haiti in 1915 was motivated partly by apprehension that Germany and France might secure naval bases there, but also by appeals from National City Bank of New York, which had invested heavily in the island and was anxious to consolidate and reschedule the state's debts. The United Fruit Company, 1899, which became the largest foreign employer of labor in Central America in the 1920s, not the 11,920s, helped to draw the U.S. In the U.S. military support for its operations in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala. The main beneficiaries of dollar diplomacy, as it became known, were a handful of U.S. banks and a few large corporations and contractors. So dollar diplomacy is sort of a simple but memorable way to say, and this is the phrase that was used then and now, to say that American foreign policy in Latin America, probably more than in any other part of the world, was often just openly, brazenly about economic interests. Much of the time, this is true even now, the U.S. Government and its foreign policy doesn't sort of talk as much about protecting corporate interests. They talk about all kinds of other things going on to explain why the U.S. is involved here and has its sort of hand in the cookie jar over there, trying to control and shape events around the world. It's not all because of corporate interests, but a lot of it is. But in this time period we're talking about here, and in Latin America, the U.S. was just openly pursuing its own economic benefit. You can see even in American newspapers in the upper left, there were political cartoons, kind of criticizing, caustically criticizing America, sort of grasping for as much of much territory or at least control economically as possible. That's Uncle Sam, right? He's standing on U.S. soil, but he's got his arms outstretched over the Caribbean basin, out past Cuba, and kind of towards the northern part of South America. Marshall Eakin, in his History of Latin America, says that between 1898 and the early 1930s, the U.S. sent troops into Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Nicaragua, and Mexico. And in some of those places, they sent them more than once. The usual practice was to send in the Marines to establish order, take control of the customs houses, and then use the tariffs on imports and exports to guarantee payments to foreign creditors. So what often happened was the United States and its banks got various countries into debt. Those countries took out loans from American banks, and when they had trouble paying their debt, or there was any kind of political instability in the country that might get in the way of debts being repaid, the United States was pretty quick to send in the Marines, and they'd establish, law and order, take control, as it says here, and for their trouble, would take control of foreign imports and exports in terms of tariffs, which this shows you how powerful, imperialism and imperialist power can be, especially when it's the U.S. So a tariff is a tax on imports and exports, so that means that the U.S. is going in, establishing military control, saying, bringing back law and order, which sometimes they were, and then we're going to take control of your taxes. Like, well, wait a minute. The tariffs that we're collecting that go to various social programs, whatever we need our government budget to pay for, a lot of that comes from tariff duties that taxes we attach to for foreign goods coming into the country. We need those. Well, sorry, and those are our tariffs. Those are taxes, right? That are on things coming into our country. Yeah, we know, but we have the power, so we're going to take your tariff money and take it back home with us because you owe us a lot of money, right? You're either defaulted on your debt or you're late on payments, so we're going to take control of your tariffs and sort of force you to pay us back. So this is all part of what's broadly categorized as dollar diplomacy. The good neighbor policy, which followed it, coming in the 1930s. You can see the president there, seated on the right, Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose name is associated with this policy. There are a lot of historians who sort of think this wasn't much different than dollar diplomacy. It just sort of sounded a little better. Good neighbor sounds nicer. So different name, same policy? Possibly. Bentley even says, the pressures of the Great Depression and the instability of global politics led to a reassessment of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America during the 20s and 30s. U.S. leaders realized the costliness and ineffectiveness of their previous direct interventions in Latin America, like sending the Marines all the time. Well, that's exactly what they mean, especially when committing, U.S. Marines, there it is, as peacekeeping forces. To extricate U.S. military forces and rely more fully on dollar diplomacy, policymakers instituted certain innovations that nonetheless called into question any true change of heart among U.S. neo-colonialists. So it's open, I think, for disagreement, but it does appear that the Roosevelt administration was just kind of trying to put a nicer face on still ongoing, pretty much straightforward, otherwise economic exploitation and domination of Latin America by the U.S. All of this inspired, not surprisingly, radical politics in Latin America, as it did in other parts of the world as well. And I'll rely once again on Professor Bentley. The peoples of Latin America came to experience most intensely this new U.S. economic power. And it was probably no coincidence that the capitalism embraced by the U.S. came under attack. One of the first institutions in Latin America to witness this rebelliousness was the university, meaning all the universities, taking their inspiration from two revolutions inimical to ideals of the U.S. University students hailed the Mexican and Russian revolutions, which happened about the same time, and just before this time period, and in the 1920s began to demand reforms. The currency of radicalism also expressed itself in the formation of political parties that either openly espoused communism or otherwise adopted rebellious agendas for change. So the Cuban Revolution, which we know something about, we've been studying it, is sort of one of the fruits of this kind of radical opposition to U.S. policy, at least in part. Fidel Castro is one of the most successful and famous Marxist or communist revolutionaries in Latin American history. There are some others as well, Che Guevara, and some that we'll meet here. But we should note that college students have often been sort of spearheads of revolution, oftentimes sort of the shock troops that sort of carry out radical policy through protest and demonstration, etc. And so that's not anything new or a surprise here. And keep in mind that most of the radicalism was based on Marxist principles, the work of Karl Marx, which influenced, as we've seen and will see, other parts of the globe as well. Nicaragua in the early 20th century is a good example of all of this taken kind of together. U.S. financial interests had long influenced the economy of Nicaragua, as it sort of did basically all of its neighbors as well. And those substantial investments, whether in the transportation industry or in bananas, served to justify U.S. intervention when revolts or civil wars broke out. Nicaragua is a great example of American dominance, just flat-out economic dominance. In the 20s, the time period I'm alluding to right here, quoting from, the United States basically owned Nicaragua. I mean, like, it owned all the stuff. It owned, as it says here, the transportation industry. It owned the railroads. It owned the port facilities. It owned communication. It owned huge amounts of land, bananas. It owned all the industries and all the resources, and controlled the tariffs and tax money coming in. So when something happened to destabilize the society and or government in one of these countries, like Nicaragua, this is when the Marines got called in. So the mid and late 1920s again witnessed the outbreak of civil war and the repeated insertion of the Marines to restore order. Repeated insertion of the Marines. So when powerful countries, imperialist countries like the United States, have a lot of money, their money invested at risk, or what they feel is at risk by political and social instability, they will often send in troops, sometimes before doing anything else, sometimes as a last resort if they can't resolve the crisis any other way. Leading the opposition, in this case in Nicaragua, to the occupation of Nicaragua by U.S. Marines was Augusto Cesar Sandino, another one of sort of the great revolutionary radical heroes in Latin American history, a nationalist and liberal general who refused to accept any peace settlement that left Marines on Nicaraguan soil. He didn't get really what he wanted entirely, but he did become a hero who was essentially, he was assassinated, and so he was martyred. And up until the present, Sandino's name has been sort of used again as sort of a martyr to the cause of to radical causes of various sorts. But the Sandinistas, if you've heard of them before, they take their name from this episode and this man. Lazaro Cardenas and Mexico in the early 20th century. So just to pick out another country to see some of what's going on in terms of relations between the United States and Latin American countries. I use the same two countries, Nicaragua, Mexico, that our textbook does, so nothing innovative here that I'm doing. Cardenas shocked Americans and the British and the Europeans by nationalizing the oil industry in 1938. A radical move, and that's putting it mildly. Much of the oil industry previously, heretofore, had been controlled by U.S. and British financial interests. So American banks and wait a minute, you can't nationalize. So what does that mean? What's so radical about nationalizing an oil industry? Well, nationalization means that the government takes over the industry. So if your oil industry is owned by a number of private firms, oil companies, whether they're your own, or these are they were Mexican companies, Mexican CEOs or presidents, or foreign companies from Great Britain or United States, they're all part of sort of private investment in the capitalist world. So nationalization is coming in and saying, oh, all of you oil companies that make profits in this country off of oil, not any longer, because we've just come in and the government is now the oil industry. It's no longer a for-profit business. So nationalism is a socialist move. Sort of the more industries that become nationalized, the more you have a socialist economy, or the closer you're moving to it. It's not the only feature of socialism, but it is one of the main sort of policies that often happens historically, not just in Mexico, but many other places. So since the United States was, along with Great Britain, sort of the leading capitalist country in the world, and their neighbor to the south, and country they were trying to control, like any other Latin American country, they were trying to control, and had investments in their oil industry and many other things, didn't take this well. And the corporations themselves, U.S. British financial interests, called for drastic U.S. government response to this. But the Roosevelt administration, partially because it was mired in the Great Depression and trying to solve America's own domestic problems, offered and forced a compromise solution. Corporate interests were not happy about it because they'd called for compensation, saying, hey, if we're going to let this guy Cardenas get away with taking our oil interests we've invested in, and making them his own, nationalizing them, we need to be compensated fairly. And they believed that 260 million was fair. And the Roosevelt administration granted 24 million, which means Cardenas basically won. Not only did he get to continue with nationalization, it didn't get turned around. And by the way, in some parts of the world, the U.S. and other capitalist countries have been successful in forcing a country to stop nationalizing, or defeats the attempt to nationalize, and maintains its corporate economic capitalist presence there. But in this case, not only did Cardenas get his way in nationalizing the oil industry, but he did it pretty cheaply. 24 million was a small price to pay. He also was quite shrewd, as it says at the bottom. He got this smaller number based on the companies involved in the oil industry, again, American and British, and how they valued their assets in Mexico for tax purposes. So they deliberately undervalued, so they'd have to pay less taxes. And so Cardenas said, oh, we'll see. I'm just, you say 24 million is not enough, it's worth more. Well, your own tax returns right here basically says it's around this much money that you have. So we're taxing, we're going to compensate based on that, or we should anyway. And the Roosevelt administration agreed. But it does show yet another example of difficult, dicey relations between the U.S. and Latin America. In this case, at least a temporary victory for Mexico against the U.S. The nationalization of the oil industry proved extremely popular in Mexico, and to this guy's credit. So he became somewhat of a hero, at least for this and this time, because it was seen as standing up against sort of the bully United States, which is what it was doing.